Hello, and welcome to the Wills Group interview training. Today we will cover an overview of structured interviews and how to conduct a structured interview. This training provides a high-level overview of the interview process. Next, modules in the training will focus on more specific tasks involved in the interview process. First of all, let's tackle the why of interview training. Often we think that because someone is the best IT manager around, he or she will obviously be able to hire the best IT people for the team. This actually may not be the case. Although these managers are skilled and trained in their fields, when it comes to finding the right people to fill positions, they may need some expert interviewing advice, just as they may need advice on their health from a medical doctor or advice on their finances from a financial advisor. Think of a bad interview you may have had or heard about over the years. Effective interviewing is not necessarily an intuitive skill. This training will give you a better understanding of the importance of consistency and job relevance when interviewing candidates. You will learn which types of interviews and interview questions are most effective. You will gain knowledge of how to deliver the type of interview that yields the most valuable information about the candidate, and you will leave with an understanding of how to prepare for and conduct an interview. We often take for granted that because someone is an awesome manager, they will also be an awesome interviewer. With a little training, guidance, and practice, any hiring manager can become an expert interviewer. To begin, let's talk about what an unstructured interview entails. In an unstructured interview, the interviewer and candidates engage in a formal interview in that they have a scheduled time to sit and speak with each other, and both parties recognize this to be an interview. The questions may be changed based on the candidate's responses. The direction of the interview is rather casual, and question flow is based on the direction of the conversation. There is not a structured interview guide. A structured interview guide provides a list of predetermined questions and a standard protocol for conducting the interview. This is not included in an unstructured interview. Questions tend to be open-ended and express little control over informant's responses. This means that interviewers are not working to elicit behavior-specific responses. Rather, responses are left up to the discretion of both interviewer and candidate. Take a moment to reflect on what challenges an unstructured interview might present. By contrast, a structured job interview has many features that differentiate it from an unstructured interview. A structured job interview is a standardized way of comparing job candidates. The employer creates interview questions focused on the skills and abilities the company is seeking. There is a structured interview guide, which provides the list of predetermined questions and a standard protocol for conducting the interview. Each candidate is asked the exact same questions in the exact same order. Questions do not change based on the candidate's responses. Questions are designed to elicit specific behavior-based responses so that candidates can be compared directly to each other across the same competencies. Take a moment to reflect on the advantages this type of interview format might provide over an unstructured interview. Now let's talk through some of the disadvantages of an unstructured interview. Some of the disadvantages include low levels of reliability. This means that ratings tend to be inconsistent across interviewers when multiple interviewers are used to assess a candidate. Poor selection. Unstructured interviews have been shown to be poor predictors of job performance and provide less accuracy in assessing candidates compared to structured interviews. In fact, research shows unstructured interviews predict job performance less than half as well as structured interviews. Interviewer bias. Research shows that an interviewer's first impression of a candidate can impact the nonverbal behavior of the interviewer, how the interviewer phrases questions, how long the interviewer spends with a candidate, and how many questions the interviewer asks. Additionally, physical attractiveness has been shown to be the greatest correlate of unstructured evaluations of job candidates, regardless of their objective qualifications for the job. Changes in candidate behavior. Research shows that the interviewer's behavior affects the quality and quantity of information gathered from the candidate. When interviewers act warmly towards a candidate, candidates are more likely to exaggerate their accomplishments. Whereas when interviewers act coldly towards a candidate, candidates are less likely to share information. Legal challenges. Due to the lack of standardization, unstructured interviews are susceptible to legal challenges and are far less defensible in court when compared with structured interviews. Less favorable candidate reactions. Research shows these interviews draw more negative reactions from job candidates, especially when questions are not related to the job requirements. Research also shows that negative candidate reactions lead to lower likelihood of accepting a job offer if presented. In short, unstructured interviews don't allow the organization to put its best foot forward and risk highly qualified candidates looking elsewhere and leaving candidates with negative perceptions about the company. Now let's talk about the advantages of structured interviews. Consistency. Structured interviews using the same procedures and assessing the same competencies in each interview provide equal opportunity for each candidate. Reliability. Using the same procedures, questions, and rating scales allows for more consistency between interviewers when selecting a candidate. Improved selection. Structured interviews have been shown to be better predictors of job performance and provide greater accuracy in assessing candidates compared to unstructured interviews. Research shows that structured interviews predict job performance twice as well as unstructured interviews. Less opportunity for bias. Structured interviews provide candidates with the same phrasing and number of questions, as well as reducing nonverbal cues from the interviewer. This leads to less bias across candidates, as interviewers are not able to change the type or number of questions they ask based on irrelevant factors to the job, such as physical attractiveness of a candidate. Job relatedness. Structured interviews allow for more complete measurement of a candidate's job qualifications and attributes. More work is done up front to ensure the most relevant aspects of the job are included in the interview. Fairness. Structured interviews promote standardization of the process, which allows for fair testing procedures across candidates and supports legal defensibility. More favorable candidate reactions. Research has shown that the more structured an interview appears to be, the more likely candidates are to say they would accept a job offer. The interview is the single most influential factor in the hiring process, making or breaking an applicant's impression of the company. Keep in mind, while you are interviewing the candidate, candidates are also interviewing you. In order to attract and retain top talent, companies must strive to make good impressions on candidates throughout the hiring process. Now that we've covered the benefits that a structured interview can bring to your hiring process, let's talk about how a structured interview is laid out. To begin, prior to the interview, interviewers review relevant competencies to the job and the structured interview guide. These will be provided to you by your talent acquisition team. Competencies have been identified based on a scientific job analysis. During the interview, candidates answer relevant competency-based questions. Each interviewer independently observes and notes the candidate's responses. After the interview, interviewers rate each candidate on the competencies using behavioral scales. These scales are specifically designed to be based on behaviors that show demonstrated relevance to the job. In the case of a panel interview, which is when multiple interviewers are present to interview and rate a candidate at the same time, panel members will discuss their individual ratings and work to come to a consensus on a single final rating scale for each competency. These competency scores are then combined to reach a single final score for each candidate, as well as a recommendation on whether or not to advance the candidate to the next stage of the hiring process. Here are a few general guidelines for conducting structured interviews. We will go into greater detail on each of these later in the training. Make the candidate feel at ease before questioning. An overly nervous candidate is less likely to give you a realistic look at their qualifications for the job. Helping them to feel at ease will allow you to get the best and most relevant information from the candidate. Read questions to the candidate word for word. In a structured interview, deviation from the script is not allowed. This gives every candidate a fair and equal chance to respond concerning their job qualifications. Listen attentively to candidates' responses and allow the candidate to elaborate or clarify his or her answer. Interviewers are not allowed to deviate from the script, but candidates should be given every opportunity to display their relevant job skills. Ask follow-up or probe questions when necessary. If a candidate is unclear, follow-up questions may be used to elicit a more complete answer. Take non-evaluative notes about candidates' responses and behavior during the interview. Notes will be behavior and fact-based and will not include any evaluations until after the interview is complete. Rate the responses individually on the rating sheet without discussing ratings or impressions with anyone, including other panel members if it is a panel interview. All interviewers should make their own conclusions about a candidate's qualifications before swaying or being swayed by others' opinions. For a panel interview, after completing the ratings, there should be discussion of these ratings to come to a consensus with second-level managers or other panel members. This consensus will be used to decide whether the candidate moves forward in the hiring process. Let's talk through some do's and don'ts of the interview process. During the interview, interviewers should be sure to maintain objectivity and provide an opportunity for the candidate to do his or her best. Ask questions in the order of the competencies listed on the rating sheet. This sheet will be provided to you by your talent acquisition team. Ask questions exactly as they appear. It is important to ask questions in the same order and in the exact same way in order to maintain the structure of the interview. This also allows all candidates the same fair and equal opportunity to do well in the interview. Repeat the question if asked by the candidate, and permit the candidate to skip a question and come back to it. While interviewers are not allowed to deviate from the order and wording of the questions, they are allowed to repeat or skip and come back to a question if requested by a candidate or if the candidate appears to be struggling. Ensure you have a clear understanding of the candidate's responses. If necessary, ask probing or follow-up questions to gain more clarity. Remember to set the tone and make a good impression. Candidates are observing interviewers and forming impressions of the interviewer and the company's professionalism, attitude, competence, fairness, and thoroughness. It is important to make a good impression in order to attract the best candidates for your organization. Interviewers should not give any feedback to the candidate, verbal or nonverbal, during the questioning period. They also should not challenge statements made by candidates. For example, why would you do that instead of this other thing? For clarity, follow-up questions or probes may be used, but they are only intended to elicit a more complete answer or to help clarify the candidate's answer. Follow-up questions should not include anything that is not directly related to one of the predetermined questions in the interview guide. Interviewers should not answer candidates' questions about specific details of the interview questions. Some candidates try to gain insight into the right answer by asking interviewers to clarify what they mean by a question. For this reason, no further detail or explanation of a question should be given, as it may give this type of candidate an unfair advantage. Instead, interviewers should only repeat a question exactly as written. Interviewers should not ask questions about the candidate's background or disability. They also should not attempt to identify a candidate's race, ethnicity, political, or religious affiliations. Additionally, interviewers should not ask questions about marital or parental status or family caregiving issues. All of these questions are illegal, and they should be avoided. Interviewers should not ask additional follow-up questions other than those specified by their interview guide or probing questions intended to clarify a candidate's response. These can change the focus of the interview and give candidates an unfair advantage or disadvantage. Now we're going to cover a few basics around how to prepare for an interview. First, interviewers should strive to create a comfortable and open environment to encourage the candidate to share information. This includes seating the candidate across from the interviewers so that they can see the candidate and his or her nonverbal gestures, as well as keeping the room comfortable, quiet, and well lit. In order to open the interview, an introduction should be made. An effective introduction clarifies the interview procedures, establishes the tone, and projects a professional image and respect to the candidate. In a panel interview, there will be one lead interviewer who will be designated to greet the candidate and introduce him or herself to the panel members. To begin, you'll want to build rapport with your candidate. Rapport refers to creating a relaxed, open atmosphere that will encourage the candidate to speak freely. In order to establish rapport, here are a few basic guidelines. Be courteous. Greet the candidate at the door, show him or her where to put personal belongings, and ask how they wish to be addressed. Use a conversational tone. Do not speak in a dull or monotone voice when reading the script or interview questions. Show interest in the candidate to maintain rapport throughout the interview. Use prompts like pauses, head nodding, and ahas to indicate you are listening to the candidate. Lean forward slightly and look up from taking your notes without staring. Let the candidate talk 80% of the time while listening and taking notes. Once rapport has been established and you understand how to maintain it over the course of the interview, and there has been an official introduction, it's time to begin the interview. All interviewers should read the questions exactly as written in the order they appear. In a panel interview, panel members should rotate asking questions, giving everyone on the panel an active role and a way to interact with the candidate. All interviewers should take non-evaluative, behavior-based notes about the situation, action, and result for each question. We will cover more about how to do this in the next training module that describes exactly what behavior-based notes look like and how they should be documented. Finally, interviewers should not rephrase questions. Again, if the structured interview is deviated from, it has the potential to change the nature of the question and give some candidates an unfair advantage over others. Once questioning is complete, in order to conclude the interview, the interviewer should check to ensure they do not need further clarification about the candidate's responses. If it is a panel interview, the panel should also be asked if they need additional clarification. If questions were skipped during the session, the lead interviewer should provide the candidate with another opportunity to respond to those questions at this time. Additionally, if the candidate has any questions, he or she should be given the opportunity to ask them during this time. The interviewer will then describe next steps for the candidate and then close the interview and dismiss the candidate. At this point, none of the interviewers should discuss the candidate's responses until all interviewers have had the opportunity to independently complete their individual ratings. If it is a panel interview, group consensus will be conducted following the completion of all individual ratings. Now let's put some of this into practice. Grab a pen and paper and write down all of the things that are done wrong in the following example. Meredith walks into her structured panel interview. Her interviewers are shuffling through the paperwork of other previous candidates. Her interviewers look up to say a brief hello, ask her to have a seat, and jump right into questioning. They show very little interest in her responses, making no eye contact, checking their watches, and trying to rush her to answer when her mind goes blank partway through the interview. They struggle with which interviewer will ask the next question, and ask her a question about how her 2 children will affect her ability to work weekends. They close the interview without allowing her to ask questions or telling her what to expect in the coming weeks following the interview. Take a few moments to pause the training and write down all of the things that were done wrong during this scenario. Contrast this experience with the following. David walks into his interview. The interviewer stands up to greet him, shake his hand, and introduce herself to her position in the company. The room has been prepared so that only David's paperwork is on the table, and a glass of water has been poured for him. The interviewer gives him an overview of the interview, explaining the purpose and allowing him to settle before the questioning begins. She asks questions of David and shows interest in his responses by making eye contact, nodding, and allowing him to skip a question when his mind goes blank partway through the interview. She explains the requirements of the job, including the necessity of weekend work from time to time, and asks him if he will be able to meet these requirements. She closes the interview by explaining what to expect in the coming weeks and standing up to shake his hand and say goodbye. Take a few moments to pause the training and write down all of the things that were done right during this scenario. In the first scenario, the candidate is likely to leave with an adverse reaction to the company and interviewers. There was no attempt to establish rapport, the interview was not properly opened or explained, and the interviewers appeared unprofessional and unprepared. Additionally, an illegal question was asked that could lead to allegations of discrimination, and no attempt was made to inform the candidate of next steps. In the second scenario, the candidate is likely to leave with a positive impression of the company and interviewer. The interviewer established appropriate rapport, gave the candidate adequate time to answer the interview questions, and did not ask any illegal questions throughout the process. Additionally, the interviewer took time to properly open and close the interview, giving the candidate an effective introduction to the process and next steps to expect in the weeks following the interview. This concludes our training on the difference between structured and unstructured interviews, guidelines for completing interviews, and how to conduct a structured interview. Please refer to additional training modules for more information on taking behavior-based notes and evaluating the candidate. If you would like additional interview-related resources, please reach out to your talent acquisition team.